Now, more stories, insights, and analysis of Illinois policy and politics. This is Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute. Once again, your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Pat Hughes, co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project. And Pat, Governor Runner laid out in his State of the State address, and then again in his budget address, the need for structural reform in state government to stop doing what we've been doing that has us in a place where Illinois has $214 billion in total debt and only $30 billion in assets, which is why we're often described as the worst governed state in the nation, because we are. And legislation has been advanced consistent with what the governor laid out in that budget address that would give him more latitude to do what the General Assembly doesn't want to do, which is pay the things that we can afford to pay and not pay the thing and not go off on things that we can't afford to pay, and begin some of the restructuring, at least on the margins, until the General Assembly decides they're willing to act in furtherance.
Yeah, the governor, he mentioned it in his address, the Unbalanced Budget Response Act, which would give him some more executive control over the budget and how things would be paid out, hopefully, particularly for people with real need. Obviously, Dan, he needs the General Assembly's support for that act, just like he would for a reasonable budget. So he's obviously not going to get that. The only way, look, I think the governor has done a terrific job in his first year in office. And I think he had a very good job, a very good night last Tuesday night in terms of setting the tone for the election going forward. But the only way for anything to really get done for the governor's agenda is to get more people in the General Assembly, both within the caucus, so we don't have the Sam McCanns of the world, and outside the Republican caucus in the general election to replace the legislators that are in place right now. That's the only way to get this accomplished.
Well, it's interesting. So if you look at statewide election results in terms of turnout, the 8 races in which I was involved through my PAC, Liberty Principles PAC, we saw turnout increases of 50 to 60% on average. In the McCann-Benton race, which is, as we were talking about earlier, the most expensive Republican state Senate primary in history, we saw 171% increase in turnout from 2012.
It's just incredible. It's breathtaking.
And so statewide, you saw a narrowing. There was a substantial turnout on the Dem side too, but you saw a narrowing of the difference between total Republican turnout statewide and total Democrat turnout statewide. I think Republicans were about 600,000 less, which is substantially closer than it's been in previous cycles.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is attributed to the fact that independents and what used to be called Reagan or crossover or soft Democrats are starting to come out and pull Republican primary ballots. And my theory, Dan, is, it's not just mine, is that everyone attributes that to Trump, right? And obviously Trump has had an effect with respect to that. But I think if it's Cruz, or even Kasich, but I hope it's Cruz. If it's Cruz, that independent vote and crossover vote is looking for a new way of doing business, and that is not Hillary Clinton. So I think that bodes well for center-right folks who want to see a Republican, one of the Republican nominees, be elected president.
Yeah, and to your point, the story of DNA Info this week, voters in the 19th Ward, one of the Southside Irish wards, right? Voters in the 19th Ward, these are the neighborhoods of Beverly, Mount Greenwood, Morgan Park, grabbed twice as many GOP ballots as 4 years ago, up 84, well, I shouldn't say more than twice, but up 84% compared to the 2012. They did grab 4933 to 2682 in 2012. So an 84% increase, almost twice as many as they did in 2012. So it does suggest that something's afoot. I think based on what we've seen in other states, yes, it has a lot to do with Trump. But because of the unique situation in Chicago and Illinois, being the worst governed big city and the worst governed state in the nation, maybe you have some people reconsidering how they've been voting, whether it's in primaries or generals.
Well, sure. And Dan, that started in 2014, right? I mean, Bruce Rauner was elected governor in the state by about 5 percentage points in 30 legislative districts, 20 in the House and 10 in the Senate. A Democrat still holds office there, but people were willing to split the ticket and vote for Rauner. Rauner carried 30 of those districts. So the movement towards a center-right coalition in our state started in 14, is continuing into 16. I think this presidential election helps that movement because of how the presidential candidates, particularly on the right, are bringing new voters in to the center-right coalition.
And it's interesting, there was another state legislative race, didn't get nearly as much attention because kind of the Duncan Stratton race sucked up all the oxygen, at least at the legislative level. But Teresa Ma versus Eddie Acevedo's kid, so another legacy candidate, as we're wont to see in Illinois. You know, we treat public office as something to bequeath onto your son or daughter. But Teresa Ma in Chinatown defeats Eddie Acevedo's son to replace Eddie Acevedo. Kind of an underreported story, but very interesting because one of the things that happened with Teresa Ma's victory is the Chinese population in that district for the first time broke from the Madigan established Democrat power structure and said, no, this time we're going to support one of our own. We're not just going to kind of abide you handing the seat over to your son and continuing to kind of ignore us and take us for granted as just part of this coalition that you can count on. No, maybe it's time that we think a little bit differently about who our representative is.
Yeah, and if that race is an indicator for a larger trend in other races, in the general election in particular, that will be good for people who are tired of having 200 and whatever the number is in debt, 200 something $1 million in debt against 30 million in assets, or at the larger national level, $17 trillion in debt. And so maybe people are taking a closer look at not just giving the vote to the progeny of whoever else has been in office.
The other big race on Tuesday night that I think was a bit of a surprise, maybe not an outcome for many, but certainly in margin, Cook County State's Attorney's race.
Unbelievable.
Doubling up Kim Foxx, Tony Preckwinkle's chief of staff, doubling up Anita Alvarez. What is your assessment of that race and that margin?
Laquan McDonald, Rahm Emanuel, no confidence vote in the existence structure in the Democratic Party in the city of Chicago. That was a big no on Mayor Emanuel, and it was a big no on Anita Alvarez. Also, and I think she had some issues. I know there were some election issues and some questions about whether she had significant trial experience. Kim Foxx was an appealing alternative to Anita Alvarez. She came from Cabrini Green. She's a attractive personality, very sort of easy to like, and seemed that she was ready for the job and cared about the constituents at a time where the existing political structure from Emanuel down doesn't care about the constituents in the city. And I think she offered that sort of promise. And again, just like the race you mentioned previously in Chinatown, these are folks responding to what's potentially a new world order, and that can only benefit people who are opposed to the failed status quo.
Yeah, Rahm Emanuel, of course, wanted to say that race had nothing to do with me. That was a self-contained event. But clearly, this is people who were frustrated and angry about what came to light after the mayor's race last spring, and this was their opportunity to exact some vengeance, not just on Anita Alvarez as being part of what you've just described, but also Tiny Dancer as well. There's no question that Tiny Dancer was front and center in their mind when it came to that state's attorney's race. In addition to, Kim Foxx being an attractive candidate and, part of a different power structure that they've supported with Tony Preckwinkle.
Yeah, if Tiny Dancer, as you so like to call him, was on the ballot last Tuesday against Chuy Garcia or against my great friend Dan Proft, he'd have gotten his head handed to him, Dan. He'd have gotten wiped out. That's the mood of the electorate. That's the change that's taken place since the election previously to now with McDonald, with Alvarez. And it is a different movement in the city of Chicago. And that Kim Foxx election, and I don't know a lot about Kim Foxx, but just the structure of it gives me a little bit of hope that someone's going to try to pay attention to the folks whose needs there have not been taken care of.
What about the Republican primary for Senate? We've got, as expected, Kirk versus Duckworth. Kirk trying to hold that Senate seat. And Kirk on Tuesday night suggesting that one of the issues he's really going to try and distinguish himself from Duckworth on is she's for essentially whatever the president wants with respect to Syrian refugees, and he's not. So he's going to try and make the national security case against Duckworth to hold that seat. 30% of Republicans vote for a nice guy, but nobody knew who he was. You and I know who he is because we follow this day in, day out, but most people don't. 30% vote for James Martyr as a protest vote against Mark Kirk. How does he win a two-front war?
That's going to be very, very tough. He's going to have to do much better than just the Syrian refugee narrative to beat an Iraq war, veteran, someone who was injured severely in the Iraq war, because narratively, Tammy Duckworth looks very, very good in what is still in a presidential election an ostensibly blue state. The presidential candidate's going to win Illinois on the Democratic side, so that hurts Kirk. And then again, Mark Kirk, and I know because I ran against him in 2010 and nothing's changed. He is very unpopular among the Republican base. And I remember spending a lot of time trying to convince those folks to vote against Alexi Giannoulias at the time and vote for Mark Kirk. And ultimately, we were successful. But Dan, not by that much. And I think he's gotten less popular. And he is, because of his health and everything else, a far less effective candidate and senator than he was back in 2010. And I just see it as a very high order against what I think is to the Democrats and some independents, an appealing candidate in Duckworth.
Yeah, so don't rely on Mark Kirk's victory to hold the Senate if that's what it comes down to.